This is a Reforge reaction, and in this video, I'll be reacting to Yongyea's video about PlayStation getting slammed by the internet after they complained about Xbox's Call of Duty offer being inadequate. If you like these reactions, be sure to hit subscribe and the bell button. That way you don't miss them, and check out Reforge Gaming, where I stream live. I skipped maybe the first 5 seconds. He just talks about being on vacation. I did watch this one before reacting to it. Sometimes I won't do that, so the reaction's sort of more raw and off the cuff. I wanted to see what Yong said. I don't really agree with him or a lot of other people's takes on this. I'm going to try and argue as charitably as I can that they're missing the picture. They're not really hearing what they're saying. I'm going to try to show that.
Microsoft and Sony are arguing about Call of Duty, its relevance. As many of you know, Microsoft is acquiring Activision Blizzard and in turn major franchises like Call of Duty. Before I covered this Reset Era thread that talked about regulators who are looking into this to make sure this isn't too anti-competitive, and in Brazil in particular, things are made public. Third-party companies who were questioned were asked about whether they think this move could be anti-competitive, and basically every company that was asked except for Sony said that there is plenty of competition out there in terms of the types of franchises that could compete with Activision Blizzard's own IPs, whereas Sony insisted that few developers/publishers are capable of producing AAA games such as EA, Take-Two, Rockstar, Epic Games, etc. And Sony believes that none of these developers could create a franchise to rival Activision's Call of Duty. They believe that Call of Duty is so popular that it influences users' choice of console. In fact, their network of loyal users is so ingrained that even if a competitor had the budget to develop a similar product, it would not be able to create a rival, insists Sony. I personally disagree with that.
He can disagree with it. That's fine. I don't think he makes a compelling case as to how anybody else could rival the history of Call of Duty, the number of studios that work on Call of Duty. And one of the points that Sony makes is that even during one of their weakest outings with Call of Duty Vanguard, it's still one of the top grossing games. So one of the things I feel that this video fails to do, as well as many other people in the industry commentating on this, they fail to come to grips with just how massive Call of Duty is, and disagreeing isn't really arguing. You have to make a compelling case that someone could create and put as much money and as many studios into a franchise to equal and rival Call of Duty. I don't think Yong does that in this video, and neither does anybody else that he sort of cites in quotes. They all just sort of point to one reigning true thing you're going to find out in this video is they think it's hypocritical, and I'm going to do my best to just shred that because I think that's not true either.
Call of Duty is already established, and it's going to be tough to topple it, but is it impossible? No, not really. Now, if you want a more detailed...
Do you see, he doesn't make an effort as to say why. He doesn't try to argue. He just says, no, not really. What do you mean? What other publisher, what other company can throw 11 studios at one game? What other game has a franchise with this footprint? The other thing that doesn't get addressed in this video at all is that Sony makes up 48% of the purchases of Call of Duty, which is a significant piece of the discussion that is never really considered in any of the stuff that's considered in this video.
Detailed rundown of what Sony said, head over to this Video Games Chronicle article, where scrolling down you'll find all of the exact quotes that Sony relayed. But not long after, Microsoft did respond refuting Sony's claims that its Activision acquisition is anti-competitive, and insists that claims are simply unjustifiable under any quantitative or qualitative analysis. They brought up the fact that Call of Duty is coming to PlayStation and that Xbox has no plans to pull Call of Duty from third-party consoles outside of Xbox, and they brought up Minecraft, which, to be fair, yeah, they didn't pull Minecraft from other platforms. They've let that be multi-platform because they'd actually lose money if they pulled Minecraft from other platforms and made it Xbox exclusive, and they believe that it's the same thing for Call of Duty. It's so big that it's actually better for business to keep it multi-platform. And beyond...
And, okay, so the thing to not miss out here, then, is they refute the claim that it's anti-competitive by saying we're not going to rip Call of Duty off of the platforms. So the irony of these videos and some of the takes on this subject is that Microsoft essentially agrees with Sony. Like, yes, it wouldn't be profitable for us, number one, because the amount of purchases that are made on Sony, and number two, we're not going to do that. They say that to refute the claim. Like, the article he's quoting is Microsoft attempting to claim this isn't anti-competitive. Well, how do they claim it's not anti-competitive? By saying that we won't be removing Call of Duty. Microsoft is on record saying it wouldn't be profitable. I have even said their shareholders would sue them because the amount of revenue loss would be insane, and the ROI on this $70 billion purchase would be slowed down. So it's just you're not seeing the forest for the trees. Microsoft is agreeing that no, it would be anti-competitive if we ripped Call of Duty off of Sony, therefore justifying Sony's concerns to bring up one title. Keep in mind, Sony's only bringing up Call of Duty, not other titles, so later in the video when he starts talking about hypocrisy, keep that in mind.
That they insist that Sony has plenty of ways to compete against Microsoft's acquisition and their subscription model with Game Pass, so on and so forth. This is a bullet list of things that they said are good reasons for why Sony is wrong about Microsoft's alleged anti-competitiveness. Xbox also claimed that.
See, again, you have to go back and look at that. It says, according to Microsoft, the claim is wrong because it's not part of Microsoft's strategy to remove content from players, and Call of Duty will still be on PlayStation as a paid title, okay? There's also assurances from Phil Spencer that they will continue to keep Call of Duty on Xbox the way Minecraft has. He even says, we've done this approach before. So that's affirmation of Sony's concerns. Sony didn't say this buyout's anti-competitive. They expressed concerns about Call of Duty. Those concerns have been affirmed because Microsoft says we're not doing that. That's just totally lost in so much of the coverage on the situation, I think.
Sony is wrong about Microsoft's alleged anti-competitiveness. Xbox also claimed that Sony are being hypocrites by accusing them of paying developers Game Pass block fees, essentially a cash infusion in exchange for the developer not putting their game on Game Pass. It's essentially paid exclusivity. Now, more recently,
Okay, and glossing over that is a giant mistake in the coverage, because if you actually look at the details of paying to keep things off of Game Pass, the only title cited was Resident Evil Village, and Resident Evil Village was in a marketing contract with Sony. Sony was putting the trailers on their YouTube channel, they were marketing the game and putting their logo on everything, and the contract stipulated that they wanted performance parity. They didn't want the game to run better on other platforms, and they wanted right of refusal, which means if you're going to put it on Game Pass, we want it to hit our subscription first. They didn't want it on Game Pass. They didn't want it running better on other platforms because they were actively marketing the game. That contract was completely misrepresented. They weren't actively paying money to block games from Game Pass. Again, you have to do due diligence and research on these things, or it's going to be like, oh gosh, what a horrible thing for Sony to do. It was a very particular contract about one title that was not an active move to hurt Game Pass. It was, we're entering into a marketing contract with Resident Evil, and if we're going to do that, we don't want this thing showing up on Game Pass and looking better elsewhere, because that would be Sony indirectly marketing something that's good for their competitor. Like, again, so much of the coverage on this has missed nuance and details that are very important.
PlayStation has responded to a request for comment by gamesindustry.biz, and PlayStation continues to insist that they are none too happy with Xbox's Call of Duty purchase and their offer of at least 3 years guaranteed non-exclusivity, guaranteed that Call of Duty will launch on Xbox. This is contractually obligated, but beyond that, Xbox can choose to do whatever they want with Call of Duty, though Xbox insists that their long-term plan is to keep Call of Duty multi-platform. But PlayStation says that Xbox's Call of Duty offer was inadequate on many levels, and there's an exact quote that I'd like to highlight, which reads, "I hadn't intended to comment on what I understood to be a private business discussion," said Jim Ryan, CEO of PlayStation, "but I feel the need to set the record straight because Phil Spencer brought this into the public forum. Microsoft has only offered for Call of Duty to remain on PlayStation for 3 years after the current agreement between Activision and Sony ends. After almost 20 years of Call of Duty on PlayStation, their proposal was inadequate on many levels and failed to take account of the impact on our gamers. We want to guarantee PlayStation gamers continue to have the highest quality Call of Duty experience, and Microsoft's proposal undermines this principle. The general reaction on social media is that Jim Ryan is starting to come off as petty. It's hypocritical for PlayStation to say things like, oh, they're not taking into account the impact this has on our gamers, considering the various maneuvers that Sony and PlayStation have pulled that are not quite consumer friendly, the number of ways that they have ensured that major IPs and titles remain exclusive to PlayStation. Final Fantasy is brought up. Final Fantasy 16 is PlayStation exclusive, and Sony and PlayStation paid for that. They shell that money to ensure that. And guess what? That has an impact on gamers because that game is now less accessible. It forces people to purchase PlayStation in order to access that game. It's not.
And this is where context is, again, just hugely important. Call of Duty has a 20-year history with PlayStation. Final Fantasy doesn't have that with Xbox. And you have to pay close attention to what Sony's taking an issue with. Sony didn't utter a single word of complaint about the acquisition of Bethesda and Starfield suddenly going exclusive, and they didn't take any issue with Phil Spencer basically saying that The Elder Scrolls 6 would be exclusive. The reason they didn't say that is because those games don't have the size of Call of Duty, and they're not so endemic to the platform that the amount of people that would suddenly not be able to buy those titles is insane. When you're making up 48% of the purchases of Call of Duty, you have every right to say, hey, you can't rip that from our customers' hands. That would be pretty anti-competitive and anti-consumer. Pointing to certain exclusivity deals to claim they're being hypocritical misses the bigger picture. Both Sony and Microsoft over the years have paid money to get exclusive deals and make titles exclusive to their platform. Microsoft is literally trying to buy up roughly 25% of the global gaming revenue generation by buying Blizzard Activision, and that stands to be pretty dangerous for the market if all those titles suddenly get restricted to one platform. We're not talking about a single title like Final Fantasy or Street Fighter. We're talking about a chunk of the gaming market, and one of those titles in particular is so large and so endemic to the gaming ecosystem that suddenly having it only on one platform would be bad. That is completely lost in all of the charges of hypocrisy he's about to reference. And the funny thing is, you can't really say, well, Sony's been doing stuff that's anti-consumer and then justify Microsoft doing it on a grander scale. Like, that's an illogical way, an inconsistent way to argue anyway. If you're going to affirm that it's anti-consumer to pay for exclusivity, then Microsoft is anti-consumer, Sony's anti-consumer, they're all anti-consumer. And then you're admitting that if Call of Duty went exclusive, it would be probably the biggest and most significant anti-consumer action out there because it's the largest game of the bunch that we're talking about. These other games are not nearly as large and endemic to the platforms that they've either been pulled or blocked from. So I think that's lost in this section. If you're going to charge them being hypocritical, you're not looking at the real complaint that they're making. They're not saying you're not allowed to buy games and make them exclusive. That would be a stupid thing for Sony to say because they do it, and Microsoft does it. They're saying Call of Duty is too big and too endemic to our platform. This would be market restrictive. And Microsoft agrees. You've got to remember that. They agree. They're not going to do it. So it seems weird to charge them with being hypocritical when their complaint is affirmed by the very people that they're complaining about.
Not much different from what Microsoft is doing by purchasing Activision Blizzard, except Microsoft is obviously doing it on a much larger scale because they just have that much more money. But when it comes to Call of Duty, the fact that Sony and PlayStation are getting 3 years of Call of Duty and a commitment for Call of Duty to remain multi-platform beyond that, I mean, that's better than nothing. The IP is now Microsoft and Xbox's, or at least if regulatory bodies approve of this, but Sony is trying to impede the whole process by being the only ones to claim that there's no way to compete against Call of Duty.
This is incorrect because the UK's CMA has said the exact same thing. They have said that if Call of Duty gets restricted to one platform, it would be market restrictive. They are the regulator in the UK. This is not something that only Sony is claiming. That's not a fair representation. Microsoft agrees. They're even saying, hey, it wouldn't be profitable. And even the UK is saying, we're going to open up a second inquiry if you can't make assurances about Call of Duty. It's too big. Its reach is too great. It generates way too much money to be restricted to one platform. This is not only Sony saying this. Saying that other companies didn't say anything makes perfectly good sense because other platforms are not in danger of losing a title that's endemic to their ecosystem.
And that Microsoft buying Activision Blizzard and obtaining the rights to the Call of Duty IP would be devastating for competition in the gaming landscape, and that gamers would suffer for it. But not only is it possible to compete against Call of Duty and Xbox's subscription-based kind of inclinations, Sony also has no right to talk about things that negatively impact gamers when they have pulled similar maneuvers, when they have locked down exclusivity, not only Final Fantasy 16, but also Final Fantasy 7 Remake, which will likely remain PlayStation exclusive for the foreseeable future. And keep in mind that recently they increased the prices of PlayStation 5s in regions outside the United States. That's certainly going to have an impact to gamers around the world, but the argument doesn't seem to be relevant when it benefits PlayStation.
Because it's not relevant. The reason that the PlayStation 5 was increased in those markets was because of because of currency changes. Again, if you actually investigate and look into why the PS5 got more expensive in those markets, I don't like to pause and make somebody look goofy. I guess I'll go full screen. The reason the PS5 got more expensive in those markets was because of currency fluctuations, and they quite literally have to protect their profit margins. Sony is not doing something that's anti-consumer. They're doing something that they must do. You cannot allow profit to plummet simply because, well, it would be hard on the consumer. When the yen drops to such a weak state that it has, PlayStation is not the only company that has increased the price of their technology in the Japanese market because they have a legal obligation to protect their profit margins. They can't simply sit idly by and watch profit go out the door because of global currency fluctuations. So that has no bearing on the discussion with PS5s changing in price. It also has no bearing on the discussion to say that, well, Sony has done this too when they are not taking issue with buying up exclusive titles. They didn't complain about Bethesda, Starfield, or The Elder Scrolls. This is one title in particular. So if you concede that buying games and keeping Final Fantasy from Xbox was anti-consumer, then you're indirectly admitting that what Sony's complaining about would be massively anti-consumer. If Call of Duty was suddenly restricted to one platform, it would be the most anti-consumer move a company could make. So citing it as anti-consumer and then acting like, well, it'd be okay for Microsoft to do it because Yongyea? Like, what are we going to act like it's some kind of a fight on the playground? Like, is Microsoft allowed to swing back on Sony? Like, it's bad for the consumer. And that's the issue. It's restrictive to the market. That's the issue. It's not Sony saying that's not fair, you can't do that. This is more significant than buying a title like Tomb Raider or Street Fighter, all these titles that have been fought over the years for exclusivity. It's not on the same scale.
I'm not saying that one side is better than the other. The whole discussion of consolidation and, just a few major corporations acquiring a bunch of development studios and the concerns surrounding that are definitely valid. But Sony and PlayStation are being really hypocritical in the way they're approaching this discussion and acting as if they've not pulled something similar or wouldn't pull something similar if they had as much money as Microsoft wouldn't make major purchases like this. Hell, if Sony were to acquire the rights to Call of Duty, they would probably, try to make it exclusive,
Again, pausing is so hard because then they end up I don't want to make somebody look silly when I'm covering their videos. Again, the whataboutisms are just not worth mentioning here because we don't know if Sony would do that. If Sony had the capital to buy up Blizzard Activision and suddenly they owned Call of Duty, they might say the same thing that Microsoft's saying. No, it'd be counterproductive. And the reason I can say that is because Sony has all but said that about their upcoming 10 live service games that they're building. They've essentially said these will be multi-platform titles because that's what's conducive to a live service game so that anybody can play it and anybody can play together. So they've already sort of indicated their philosophy for games like this would be different. So no, I don't think we can say that. I don't think we can conclude that. I think there's actually more evidence to the contrary that Sony wouldn't do that with Call of Duty. Also, I don't know if they would be able to. I still think shareholders would get involved when a game is this large and has this big of a footprint. You can't start ripping it from platforms because that's immediate profit and revenue loss, which is counterproductive to recouping the purchase of these properties. So I actually don't think, even if we want to entertain whataboutism, I don't think it's compelling given Sony's recent commentary about their own upcoming live service games and what it would do to profit and what shareholders would likely say.
Unless it, doesn't benefit their business, but, they wouldn't be complaining about one company owning Call of Duty if it was Sony and PlayStation who were able to afford to buy this major IP. It's just, it's corporate BS. And not to mention that the reason Sony and PlayStation are arguing so much against the acquisition is because so much of their business comes from Activision Blizzard IPs, namely Call of Duty. Daniel Ahmad here posted on September 7th, fun fact, Sony was Activision Blizzard's largest customer in 2020, accounting for 17% of its sales, or $1.37 billion. And according to this Reset Era thread summarizing what was made public during Brazil's inquiry into Microsoft acquiring Activision Blizzard, Call of Duty represents an important revenue stream for PlayStation, and it is one of SIE's biggest sources of revenue from third parties.
So this isn't. So again, this is super important. They're not being hypocritical. They're literally doing what they should do. They should be protecting their interests. They should be protecting their profit. They're saying, listen, if this property suddenly is ripped from our platform, if we can't have those future sales, that's damaging to us. That's market restrictive. You're taking stuff from our ecosystem that we have now a history with and is very profitable with. Other titles don't represent that. Elder Scrolls 6 doesn't represent that. Starfield doesn't represent that. It's why Sony hasn't complained about those. They are worried about a particular title, and pointing to how much money they've made from these titles and these properties is actually exactly why they're saying what they're saying. Like, they wouldn't be a good company if they didn't say what they're saying. They would basically be like, yeah, that's fine. We could potentially lose record profits if this goes through and Microsoft decides to yank all these properties off our platform. They wouldn't be good at their job if they did that. You can't sit idly by and watch profit go out the door. Now, I might cut this video a little bit short because he starts quoting different people and they all reiterate the same thing. And I am at the 7-minute mark, so we might not do the whole video. I don't like to cut a video short, but it does start to get repetitive as he quotes other people in the industry calling this hypocritical. I don't want to keep having to dismantle the fact that that is a self-refuting argument to claim that it's anti-consumer, but then be like, it's okay if Microsoft does it.
Mind that Sony gets to keep 30% of sales through the PlayStation Store platform, and so many copies are sold through PlayStation that it makes Sony quite a bit of money, and to lose that would have a significant impact in Sony's revenue stream, so they are trying to come up with any excuse possible to try to stall Call of Duty's acquisition, or Microsoft's acquisition of Call of Duty, which finally...
Keep in mind, though, that what Sony is saying, the CMA, the regulators in the UK, they think the same thing. So they're not the only ones saying this would be market restrictive if Call of Duty was suddenly not on our platform. So again, this is bigger than Jim Ryan's being a hypocrite. I don't think that's the appropriate way to frame this. See, here's another one. Destin saying, cool story. Now let's talk about Final Fantasy for a second. Again, this is This is called a false equivalency. Claiming that Final Fantasy going exclusive to Sony is equal to Call of Duty potentially going exclusive to Xbox is a false equivalency. This is a fallacious way to argue. This is not a good way to argue.
As to social media reactions, here is Destin from IGN who said, cool story, Jim. Now let's talk about Final Fantasy for a second. And then he responded to people saying or insisting that JRPGs don't sell on Xbox, COD sells more on PlayStation than anywhere else. It's a weak argument. But Destin insisted, Xbox gamers do want to play Final Fantasy on Xbox. If it were brought to Xbox, they would play it on the console.
That is not a response to the error in logic. It's an error in logic to create a false equivalency and then to say, oh, but people want to play it. That is a complete misunderstanding of the argumentation from Sony. They are arguing about a game that is so endemic to their platform and their profit. It is not equivalent to Final Fantasy. And to just sort of dodge that point and to say, but people want to play Final Fantasy, is again a fundamental misunderstanding of what is going on, what Sony's argument is, and it also just doesn't understand what a false equivalency is.
And Dan Stapleton brought a good point. If Sony didn't think Final Fantasy was going to sell any copies on Xbox, it wouldn't have bothered to pay Square Enix to not make an Xbox version. Indeed, why bother with a cash infusion for exclusivity if it wouldn't make a difference one way or the other, if people wouldn't play the game on Xbox anyway? Sony knows that, people would play the game on Xbox. They know that by acquiring exclusivity to Final Fantasy, they are locking people to the PlayStation platform and damaging Xbox's ability to bring in new customers.
Which means every single time a company pays for exclusivity, they're guilty of that. That's a very unidimensional view of why somebody would pay for exclusivity. They don't just pay for exclusivity to block or harm the other platform. It's to make their own platform look good and appealing. Microsoft is doing this with the acquisition of Bethesda. Don't kid yourself. They're doing it with the acquisition of Blizzard Activision. They want to make their platform and ecosystem look more appealing. So this is true of anybody that does this. It's too unidimensional to make it like, oh, well, it's about hurting the other platform or blocking them or whatever. It's a way to make your platform look more appealing. And since both sides do it, this again is a misunderstanding of what Sony is piping up about. They're not piping up about exclusivity. They're piping up about the size and the scope and the reach of Call of Duty in particular.
And that's why they are paying for that, because it is beneficial to PlayStation. Content creators like Skill have commented by saying that while they see both sides, it will never not be extremely funny that a company, Sony, that built its empire on the back of exclusive content, namely locking down the best output from Japan for the better part of 3 decades, is suddenly very concerned about the impact of exclusive content on gamers. Again, it is.
And I love Skill Up, but that's a bad framing of it. They're not upset about the impact of exclusive content. That's not what the argument is. They didn't say anything about Starfield or The Elder Scrolls 6 or any of the other property in the acquisition of Blizzard Activision. They're zeroing in on one title. That's the point. Everyone's missing the bigger picture here.
It is very hypocritical of Sony to talk about their concerns on how we, the customers and gamers, will be impacted when they have done things actively to negatively impact us in order to bolster their business. Here is Brett Medlock pointing out how Sony has paid for Forsaken exclusivity, Final Fantasy 16.
He meant to say Forspoken. And again, I'm gonna end the video here because he starts to reference people that I would prefer not have on my channel. I like Yong, but he starts pulling up tweets from people that I don't want to focus on. But Forspoken and Final Fantasy and Street Fighter and Deathloop and Spider-Man, none of these titles have a long-standing endemic history to the Microsoft ecosystem. They have not been damaging to Microsoft's existing revenue funnels of profit. Sony has every reason and every right to say this platform, this title is way too interwoven into our customer base to suddenly lose access to it. And the grand irony of the entire situation is that Microsoft agrees with them. They're on record saying it wouldn't be profitable. They're on record saying they're going to follow the same approach they have with Minecraft. The only way this deal goes through is if they make those assurances. Regulators are quite literally saying, we need assurances that this thing doesn't go exclusive. Call of Duty's too big. It'd be market restrictive. So the actual people involved in overseeing the deal and the regulators, funny enough, they seem to agree with Sony. So people calling it hypocritical, people saying they're angry about exclusivity, is a fundamental misunderstanding of what's going on in this situation. And the rest of the video sort of just delved into repeating that fact, that it was hypocrisy. And I just feel, unfortunately, that's a very poor framing of this, because I'm not even defending Sony, honestly. I'm defending the market. A market where one of the biggest titles gets ripped into one system, even the regulators themselves are saying, that's not good. We can't have that. And that's the same approach I'm taking. I don't even play Call of Duty on my PlayStation. I play it on my Xbox. but I don't think it would be good for the market or the consumer to allow a company the size of Microsoft to start buying up some of the biggest property in the ecosystem, in the economy of gaming, and start siloing it to their ecosystem only. That wouldn't be good for you, and it certainly wouldn't be good for me. So let me know what you think in the comments below. If you like these Reforge reactions, sometimes I'm going to have to be pretty critical and sort of dissecting an argument, but I'm going to try and do it in a respectful way. If you like this content, check out Reforge Gaming, where I stream live, and I'll see you in the next Reforge Reaction.